Welcome to the Trust Psyche podcast
on archetypal astrology and depth psychology.
I'm Jessica DiRuzza, MFT, and I'm a psychotherapist, astrologer, and teacher. I have an online psychotherapy practice that includes astrology with individuals and couples. I also offer supervision and consultation to therapists.
And I'm Travis DiRuzza, PhD. I'm a scholar, astrologer, teacher, and counselor. I offer astrology readings, astrological mentoring, and counseling. Together, for over a decade, we run the Trust Psyche School of Astrology and Depth Psychology.
We have online, on-demand astrology courses for all levels, from brand new beginner to professional astrologers and therapists.
You can find us at trustpsyche.com, where you can enter your email address to receive all our videos, podcasts, articles, and events to your inbox.
Follow us on Instagram at trust.psyche and on our YouTube channel, Trust Psyche.
We love creating cosmic content for you.
Thanks so much for being here with us. We hope you enjoy this episode. What a pleasure it is today to get to talk about one of my favorite subjects with one of my favorite humans and astrologers. Today, Travis Michael DiRuzza and I are going to be talking about our psychological understanding of the planetary archetype of Saturn. Everything that we're going to be sharing in this episode relates to an aspect or a facet of Saturn. And what the inspiration for this episode came from is the difference between choosing to live a life of authenticity or from the authentic self versus choosing to live a life from duty or from the false persona or false sense of self. This very much relates to the moon card in the major arcana. Really love the tarot interpretation of Angeles Arian in her book, The Tarot Handbook. And this very much is about how each day we get to wake up and make the most important choice that we can make, which is the choice to live authentically or the choice to live from duty. And so we're going to do a deep dive today into what that actually looks like, and just wanting you to hear that everything we're about to say is part of the planetary archetype of Saturn.
Yeah, I love this topic, Jess, and I like this way of framing it, of seeing these two facets of Saturn, of duty and authenticity. And I think the duty side is pretty clear. We see that Saturn gives us burdens to carry. It gives us the weight of responsibility, that spirit of gravity that demands exertion to be carried forward. But I think the authenticity side is a little bit less obvious. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how you see authenticity as a core expression of Saturn?
I'd love to. So Saturn is the guardian of the threshold. What does that mean psychologically? Saturn represents authority. Authority can be something that's external, which it is for most people. An authority that comes from one's parents, society, religion. Saturn is the moral governance of life, right? It's law, rules, governance, morality, and that is all an external representation of authority. But there's an internal experience of authority where through our own conscious decisions, we take accountability and responsibility for the choices that we make that can come from an inner morality or an inner place of knowing that comes from our wisdom, our inner compass, where we decide what is right and wrong for us. And it's a decision that nobody else can make. And that's what it means to come from an authentic place, is you're coming from your true essence. And so I think there's a component of Saturn that represents our true essence, our inner authority, and that is being the guardian of the threshold of what matures us into actually being an adult.
I love that, Jess. I think another aspect of Saturn here is that Saturnian part of discernment. I just want to bring out how there's that place of authenticity we're speaking about, that place of duty, that authenticity that comes from an internal place, but we want to distinguish that too from another expression of Saturn, which is the superego in its most kind of basic sense as an internalized or introjected standard of duty or of morality that is an internalization of the external thing you're talking about. And so sometimes we have to discern between that inner voice of the constrictive, authoritative superego, which is an inner voice that is an introjected version of the outside, and that true authentic voice that you're talking about that also comes from the inside, but is a little hard to hear amongst the shouts and demands of the superego at times.
Well, I think this is the difference psychologically between the superego, which is composed of judgment, criticality. There tends to be more of a harsh tone. It can be punitive. It's punishing. It's looking down upon us from the outside, from these eyes of judgment, versus conscience. And conscience is knowing the difference between right and wrong, which is something that we really can only truly know from inside of ourselves. And conscience is, you know what, I messed up, I made a mistake, but I'm human, I'm going to learn from it, and it's okay, and I forgive myself, and I have compassion for myself, and I'm not going to punish myself or shame myself for my mistake. I'm going to recognize that I am fallible and have limitations, which is part of Saturn, which is part of living on Earth and being human, is having limitations and fallibility and making mistakes, not being perfect. Whereas the superego wants to come in and punish us for making mistakes, not being perfect, messing up, and put us down, which usually compounds trauma and compounds our sense of being wrong or bad. And usually when we're operating from that place, we tend to make more decisions that are out of alignment or incongruent with our true inner knowing or authentic self. It actually makes us more duty bound and not less duty bound.
Yes, it's an amplification of that duty voice that comes from the inside.
Yeah, so anytime we're operating from a place of should or feeling guilty, that is one of our quickest ways of knowing that we're coming from a place of duty versus authenticity. The thing about duty, and we're going to go into both and give real examples of this, but the thing about living a duty-bound life where we're still trying to get approval or validation from the outside world, whether that's our parents, society, our bosses, anyone who carries a sense of authority or power in our psyche. As long as we are living life and making decisions based upon that, or based upon trying to please people and make them happy, often at the expense of our own well-being and causing our self-harm, we are living a life that is not authentic. And the problem with that, symptomatically, there are many, but usually it's one of the greatest tolls on our mental health. And the way that it shows up in symptoms is through things like depression, high levels of anxiety, a feeling of isolation and separation, loneliness, despair. And one of the greatest tragedies of being human, and one of the most awful experiences that we can have as human beings, is the despair of not being our authentic self, of not being seen and celebrated for who we truly are. And it's one of the greatest leading causes of mental health issues.
I think another way that somatically it manifests a lot of times, we see it as chronic fatigue. We see it, in just a sluggishness and a lack of energy and vitality. And I think that that is the kind of natural physical correlate of not being at one with oneself, that carrying the cost and the burden of carrying that inner dissonance all the time and feeling deep down at odds with yourself.
It's the number one zapper of life force energy. Part of the difficulty in living a life from an authentic self is you're almost guaranteed to disappoint the people around you and to disappoint your loved ones, to potentially not have their understanding or their approval or their unconditional love, which is the setup from the beginning, right? We only live a duty-bound life when the love that we have experienced from our caregivers or society is a love that's conditional versus unconditional, a love that is transactional, a love that tells us that our worth is based on what we do and how we perform versus who we actually are.
Yeah, I also see this rooted in just the inevitable childhood situation of dependence. At first, upon the family, upon the social group, upon the tribe, we begin in a place of dependence. And in many situations, that dependence at some point gets leveraged against us to push us to fulfill the desires and expectations of those who have more power than us in the system. And I think that the kind of transactional nature of duty in its kind of shadow forms is a carryover of this sort of dependence relationship, where it's at first, we need to obey the rules of the family. We need to obey and continue to obey the rules of society because of the ways that we're dependent on some of these structures.
Yeah, and so this brings in that component of Saturn, which is obedience. And when we're young, there is a certain component of obedience that does happen to our caregivers and to going to school and to our teachers, or perhaps whoever are the leaders in your community, whether that's religious or otherwise. And part of the maturational process of Saturn, as we individuate and as we grow and we become adults and we become self-possessed and we become our own person, right? The goal here in the individuation process psychologically is to become masters of our own domain.
Right.
And I really do think this is the definition of being an adult, and I think it's why we live in a world mostly still of adolescence, and why our species is still very adolescent, is because I think the vast majority of people aren't living authentically. They're still living from a duty-bound place, and a duty-bound place by nature is actually not someone who is living from the master of their own domain. And so we think of Nietzsche here when we think of this.
Yeah, I mean, I like how we're bringing out this growth process here. It's not like duty was a place we ended up in by accident. It's kind of a necessary stage, especially in this framework of the dependence that we begin our lives in. And there's this individuation process, this arc that's unfolding. Nietzsche characterizes this through one of his famous parables that shows up in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he says that there are three metamorphoses of the spirit. And at first, the spirit is a camel. The spirit, the camel says, "I must." The camel is duty-bound. It carries the burdens of the world and of society upon its shoulders. That is its directive, that is its imperative. But at some point, the spirit metamorphoses, and it becomes a lion. And the lion says no. The lion has this force of negation to say, I will thrust off these burdens, and I can choose myself. This empowering of self, this empowering of volition. But with some time and with some examination, the lion realizes that in this way it's still defined by the duties, by the power structures that surround it. By simply saying no, and embracing negation, it becomes a kind of negative image of what the parents or the authorities wanted. The child who simply does the opposite of what their parents said is still defined by them, even if in a negative way. At this point in the parable, the soul has to endure the life and death struggle with the dragon in the heart of the desert. There's a bit more that could be said, but the final metamorphosis of the spirit, the soul becomes a child, and the child is able to say the sacred yes, is able to create, to say the creative yes from that inner place of authentic knowing and decide who they are, to decide what they want, to make choices from that internal place. No longer making choices from duty, nor just making choices in reaction to duty, but truly being a center of gravity unto oneself.
For me, this parable represents the journey of individuation psychologically and spiritually. It's a beautiful illustration of the death rebirth process that I believe we must go through in order to achieve true freedom. Because what authenticity is it's true freedom. It's a life where you are truly free on all levels, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, because you live for yourself and you take full responsibility for your life. And one of the main things that defines this is we no longer are living a life in resentment, contempt, harming ourselves, being self-destructive. And this very much comes from the component of Saturn of knowing how to have healthy boundaries, knowing how to say no in order to be able to say the sacred yes, which for me, the sacred yes in the authentic self is a deeply spiritual commitment, a spiritual path, because the sacred yes comes from our true essence, which is our birthright and how the divine made us. It is the true expression of our soul, and I believe why we're ultimately all here. But the only way to get to our true essence and that sacred yes is by first being able to do what the lion does and to say, no, I don't like this. No, I don't want to do this. No, that's not okay with me. No, that doesn't feel good. And that is something that is very difficult for most humans to be able to do in a genuine way.
Yeah, the other tarot card that's been in our orbit around some of these conversations and is coming to mind to me now is the Emperor. And I think the Emperor is poignant here because it's a great symbol of the way that Saturn gets combined with a symbol of power. Some Mars energies, this lion that we're talking about in the parable. The Emperor, in its astrological correlate, is Aries, and has that power behind it, but that symbol of the emperor is also very Saturnian, the one who makes laws, the one who makes rules, the one who imposes boundaries and barriers for the betterment of society, at first brush in the analogy here. But what does it mean to be emperor of one's own self and to embrace that kind of power, that power to say no like the lion by imposing barriers and boundaries, Saturn, ultimately in service of one's authentic self.
Yeah, and it's the component of Saturn of why we have boundaries in the first place is for protection. We're protecting our life force energy. We're protecting our vitality by saying no, by having healthy boundaries, by knowing how to actually take care of ourselves and what it is that we need in our own unique individuality and who we truly are in our essence, to be able to actually know how to protect our life force, how to protect that vitality. And the thing is when we're living by duty, by shoulds, by some external guide of affirmation of approval of our goodness, or at the very least that we're not bad, is we are often being used as a pawn in somebody else's game or somebody else's drama. We're not actually in the driver's seat of our own life. We are beholden to the whims of those around us by what they say or do or how they treat us or how they insert or invade themselves into our life. And without having the emperor there with the courage and the power to say, no, there are walls here and you are not welcome in. What is not for my highest good and for the highest good of my kingdom, right? My own inner kingdom, the kingdom of my family, is not welcome here. And that's the thing, is when we live a duty-bound life, we often feel powerless because we are beholden to the whims of those around us, which is usually an experience of feeling used and not seen by those people.
I think what you're saying here is really helpful for kind of shocking us out of a little bit of the autopilot that can go on. You know, sometimes we feel bound by duty, and it kind of just makes us feel a little bit weak, and we're just kind of coasting through life trying to address the different demands upon us. And no, we don't feel empowered, but it just kind of feels like you can get focused on, okay, well, I'm doing this to take care of this thing, and lose sight of this part that you're bringing out, that no, when you're living in that way, not only are you powerless, but you're positively being used, being somehow, like you said, a pawn in someone else's game. Your energy is being siphoned off towards somebody else's directives, somebody else who, perhaps through pure selfishness, but nonetheless is in touch with what they want, is in touch with that drive in themselves that says, I'm going to try to get what I want from life. That can be coming from, a pretty shallow, self-centered place, but we can make an argument that they're more in touch with trying to reach for what they think is going to feed them than the person who is so honored, so bound by duty, so much the yaysayer, so much the placater. This brings to mind the other famous Nietzsche quote that the person who cannot obey themselves will be commanded. I think that quote also brings out this positive, violent quality of, if you're not in touch with your own inner authentic voice and not acting from that place, you're not just giving your energy away to help others. You're positively being enlisted in somebody else's schemes, and you can't even really cast that as altruistic anymore. I think sometimes people give themselves a pass on being duty bound because they're saying, well, I'm helping this or that person. Oh, this family member really needs me, and so at least I can feel like I'm a good person, even though I'm acting from this kind of place. But oftentimes, I think that's a mischaracterization.
I do too, because it's not actually unconditional love coming even from us, right? If we're there trying to do something for someone else and we're going against ourselves, we're overriding our no, this doesn't work for me, or I can't do this, or I don't want to do this, and we're causing ourselves harm in order to be quote unquote good, a good daughter, a good wife, a good husband, a good father, a good sibling, a good whatever, a good employee, and we're actively causing ourselves harm in doing that. That's not unconditional love, because we're not actually loving ourselves. It's not coming from a free place inside. It's coming from a place that is a should, which is a distortion of conditionality, and it's also coming from a place inside that is probably being driven by fear and guilt, which are two shadow sides of Saturn. Being fear-bound and coming from a sense of guilt, we contort ourselves. And when we contort ourselves, when we say yes to something that is actually a no, that's when life gets really funky. It gets wacky. It gets out of alignment, and we usually are in distress. If we're in a lot of stress, or we're in agony, or we're in self-hatred or contempt, then that's a pretty good clue or indication that we are overriding our inner compass, our inner yes or no, and living from a place of duty versus authenticity. I mean, that's one of the quickest ways we can kind of make that self-assessment.
So what do we do with, I think a big part of what's so hard to make this shift, make this leap, make this transition is the fear of being rejected, the fear of not belonging, of our family thrusting us out, of our peer group thrusting us out, and the loneliness that can ensue from being right with oneself.
Absolutely. That fear is primal. It's hardwired into our bodies and our brains. As you mentioned earlier, human beings are dependent on one another. We're dependent from the moment we're born for our survival, physically and emotionally. And so the structure of the family system and the parent-child relationship is at the root of how we experience the interplay between our natural human dependence and then also our need for independence. And how is that negotiated within the family? How is that a need for autonomy, which Saturn very much is about? How is that paradoxical interplay of the truth of our dependence and independence handled by the family culture? Especially by the caregivers to the children. The structure of power and how we experience it is rooted in the relationship between the parent and the child. And then the rest of society are just essentially holographic extensions of the way that the negotiation of dependence and independence is happening within any given family. So the threat of rejection is very viscerally real, and it's something that anybody who chooses to live authentically must come up against. And that's part of the Saturn initiation and the threshold that we must choose to step over again and again and again. There's this repetition of Saturn, of having to make this choice again and again, that I'm going to choose what is right for me, even in the face of the potential threat of the loss of the other.
I think that's so deeply rooted in, ultimately I think it's rooted in the fear of death, right? That if we're cast out of the tribe, we will not survive. And so I think that taps into that biological level of, at a certain point in evolution, you needed to do whatever you had to do to stay part of the group in order to ensure your survival. And even though that's not the case in certain ways on a physical level, I feel like that superstructure of whether we belong socially, it's kind of predicated on the same thing. And this was kind of what I was trying to bring out with the way there's this slow transition between the original dependence relationships and the kind of transactions that can go on there, and how that carries over into this more abstract level of moral, social conditioning.
Yes.
I think like a really common and salient example of this that might help bring out what we're talking about is how money is involved in a lot of times in family relationships, parent-child relationships. And often, right there at the threshold of the adolescent starting to get to the point where they might grow up, early on in that process, they're typically still financially dependent on their parents in some way. And in a lot of situations, you see the parents leveraging that financial dependence to elicit a certain kind of behavior out of the child. And that makes it really clear how, okay, this financial dependence and the transactional nature there, that's connected to survival, whether you're going to be able to feed yourself, whether you're going to be able to continue to live. But a lot of times in those situations, it's being leveraged in such a way to get the child to do something socially or morally, or follow a career path that the parents like. Something a little bit more abstract, not quite so concrete as just surviving. But I think, even once the child has achieved financial independence, the same sort of dynamics seem to be going on. this connects to another Nietzschean concept. I think a lot of this conversation has a deep dialogue and background with Nietzsche's book, The Genealogy of Morals, where he deeply examines the root of morality, the root of Western morality, the influence of Christianity upon that transformation from a kind of warrior morality that pervaded the Greek and Roman times, and how much our sense of morality shifted with the advent of Christianity. And that's a long conversation, but one of the points he brings up is, especially in German, we see a similar etymological root between the word for guilt and the word for debt. Guilt is Schuld, debt is Schulden. And Nietzsche wants to bring out how the whole moral superstructure of guilt and feeling beholden to another person is actually predicated on this more commodity, transactional basis of debt, of owing something to someone. And I think this conversation around children and parents and financial dependence kind of brings out the way that a debt, a kind of commodity and financial dependence transaction, then gets carried over into these higher level questions of social mores, what's expected of one, what we owe to one another. And so I think that's a real rich middle point there, and I think it's one that is very alive for a lot of folks. And a lot of people can't, if this issue of choosing authentic self versus choosing duty is showing up for them in the family situation, a lot of times this is the last breaking point of what keeps someone from making that decision. If your parents have financial power over you, then at the end of the day, you can't choose your authentic voice without blowing that up.
And I think that what's happened in modern times is now that has fully translated, we are the most psychological we've ever been. Psychologically, if we feel indebted to our parents or that we owe them something, which is something that is entirely set up by how the parents raise the child. If you are raised in a family where the love is conditional and not unconditional, one way you're going to know that is that you feel like you owe your parents something, that you're in some way indebted to them. And the way you can tell this, it's really common, is something like this. Okay, there's so many examples of this, but let's just go with a simple one. My dad called today. Okay. Do you want to talk to him? No, not really. I always feel actually really drained after I talk to him. It makes me really anxious. Okay. So is it a choice not to talk to him today? Well, no, not really. Right there, we've lost authenticity, and now we're in duty because we're in guilt and a should and a sense of indebtedness. And then everything that comes after the but of, no, I don't have a choice, or no, it's not an option to not pick up the phone. It goes like this. No, because you know what? He's getting old. Oh, okay. No, I have to call him back because if I don't call him back, then my mom will be mad. Oh, okay. So you're calling him in order to not make somebody upset, even though it's causing yourself harm and you don't want to do it. It's a clear no inside, but we're overriding that no for some external thing where we're putting other people before us. And this is very, very common. It happens in small and big ways all the time. And the thing is even if there is not financial dependence, there is emotional and psychological dependence that hasn't yet been severed. And this is the piece of Saturn as part of the guardian of the threshold, which is the linchpin within that dynamic is this very simple but profound truth, which is the only person on this planet who can give you a sense of worthiness is your own self. There is literally no other person who will ever be able to give that to you. And so the only way we can truly belong to ourselves and love ourselves and value ourselves is when we are ready to give our own self our sense of worthiness. And then that is what gives us the ability to truly make decisions from an authentic place versus from a place of duty, an external image of whatever it is we're trying to, on a deeper level, usually unconsciously, get validation and approval, which we know will never ever actually work.
Yeah, this is the other side of the camel phase. It's like not only do you take on the burdens and the duties, but that's how you receive your self-worth too, from the outside. It's all happening from the outside, good and for good and bad.
And I think the greatest loss here is kind of returning back to that sense of vitality, and the emperor having the walls up around the kingdom is people often say to us, like, wow, you're so successful, you're so good at manifesting your dreams, you're so good at bringing to reality your visions. This is all Saturn, the manifestation, the incarnation, the making real of whatever it is into consensus reality, into the physical material world. And my response to that is, well, it's a deep spiritual practice where I and we have sacrificed to make sacred everything in our life because we have very strong boundaries. We say no to a lot of people and situations that are not right for us, that do not feel good to us, that feel toxic or harmful or just not in alignment with our truth. And we have upset and disappointed family and friends again and again because we say no when something's not right for us. And therefore are then able to say the sacred yes of the child in the parable to what we want to incarnate, what we are choosing to direct our life force energy to bring into the world. And the only way our vitality and our life force energy can be clean and clear and full of vibrancy to manifest our dreams into reality is having the emperor's ability to say no to anything and everything that is not for our highest good, which can only be defined by us and nobody else. Not our parents, not our siblings, not our friends, not our coworkers, nobody except us.
And it's not to say that it isn't a lonely path sometimes. And I've been having the same reflection about the spiritual path in general. I share this with Jessica quite often, that the beginning of my spiritual journey, I thought that it was going to make me feel more in communion with the world around me, more at one with my peers in deeper union. But as it turns out, the spiritual path can make you feel quite isolated as you see some of the shortcomings of the world around you, as you see your own shortcomings, and as you grapple to be the person you want to be and to surround yourself with the kind of people that you think you deserve and that you would like to see in the world and you would like to see yourself in. It can be isolating. And that's a real part of it. That's a real part of Saturn as well.
Do you want to talk at all and kind of help us bring this down to earth about just like some of our own personal Saturn struggles with the practice of living from an authentic place versus a false persona, and just like what some of the real kind of grind and suffering, all aspects of Saturn that have been there for us as we've been choosing to live this way?
Sure.
Like, what have been some of the hard or challenging things for you choosing to live authentically?
I think most recently the hardest pieces have been having to cut off members of my family. I've had to put distance between myself and both of my brothers, which has been extremely, extremely hard for me. My older brother was my best friend growing up. And both of them, all three of us, have been very close throughout our lives. And I never imagined throughout the duration of my life that it would ever come to this.
Mm.
But for my own well-being and for my family's well-being, I've had to take a space of no contact with both of them. It's been full of grief, but it's been clearly the right decision for me and my family, and clearly the only way to take myself out of a place of harm.
Yeah. I think the decision to have that level of boundary with any person but with a family member is something that often is a very private and unseen process. You know, it's taken years and years and years of getting there, with every attempt to not have that be the outcome, and trying to literally do everything else possible to not have that be the case.
Just bend over backwards to try to find a miracle.
And to, you know, have the maturity to be very clear and nonviolent communication around what it is that you need in order to stay in contact and in relationship. And when those things repeatedly can't be done year after year, and more events take place that cause you and your family harm, you get to the point where you're like, the recovery time, the time and the energy that it is taking to spend 1 hour with you or 1 day with you is costing me weeks of my life. That balance sheet is so out of proportion that if I don't stop this, I am saying that I'm willing to give over my life, my time, my energy, my resources, things I can never get back, to this dysfunction. For what?
And we can become so accustomed to it in the context of family drama. I think that we live through it so much that it can start to feel normal, and I think it's also normalized by society at large. But I know I've said this before, one of the things that just brought it into such stark focus for me was having a child and being able to have this outside perspective of what's good for this child, what am I willing to subject them to, and what am I not willing to subject them to? Who gets to be around them? You know, what are the, you know, voices and dialogues going on, and how is that imprinting my child? It gave me a little bit of an outside perspective that I had trouble having on myself. I had trouble saying, what are the voices around me? How is that imprinting me? What do I subject myself to? But I think that distance helped me to see it more clearly, to say, I'm not going to put my child in these situations where they can be experiencing harm, where they're witnessing violent behavior, and then realizing I shouldn't be putting myself in those situations in the first place, and making a decision for the good of my family. I'm not going to do that anymore, even though being in that drama kind of feels normal, and even though it's one of the biggest taboos to cut off your family in any way. And this taboo reaches right back to that biological level of, it used to not be okay to cut off your family in the tribe because your survival depended on it. And so it's cellularly difficult to engage in such a thing. I think this brings in this. This is a conversation that's up right now around in therapy in general, and it's becoming much more talked about online. Going no contact, cutting off your family as a necessary step in healing from toxic, dysfunctional situations. I read an article in the Times last week. I think the title was something like, "Is cutting off your family good therapy?" There's this guy, I think his name was Patrick Tian, who's very popular on the internet for this. It was an interesting article to read. Took in both sides, the children who are doing the cutting off, how the parents that are on the receiving end of this, and how they feel about it. But I wanted to ask you, Jess, from a psychotherapist's point of view, um, how we can hold this in a little bit more of a nuanced way. You know, some of these voices online just sound so gung-ho, like, yes, it's a really good thing to cut off your parents. It even sounds like therapists are encouraging their clients to do this.
Yikes.
Yikes. And on the other, on the other side, there's also therapists who, some of these people who are just having these circular toxic issues with their family are saying things like, yeah, but you'll really miss them if you cut them off, or how are you going to feel when they're on their deathbed? Just making interventions that seem to step over the line on the parents' behalf, urging their clients to stay in a toxic situation, which is also a yikes.
Well, I'm really glad you're bringing this up because either encouragement or suggestion is a misuse of power in the therapeutic relationship. I don't believe any therapist should be telling their client or any other human being what to do. That goes against everything that I believe in and the way that I practice. It's our job as therapists to support our clients to getting to their truth because it can only come from inside of them. That's authentic living. If they're doing what I'm telling them to do, that's duty bound. They're looking for my approval and then they're looking for me to tell them what to do. That's why I don't give advice or do my best not to because then we're just replicating the same dynamic over again. So, if we're going to live authentically, we need someone who we can trust, who's safe, to allow us to explore over time, what our truth is and what we need in order to take care of ourselves. And for some people, that is cutting off family, whether that's temporary or lifelong. And for other people, that's not the case. There's other ways that we can work with having boundaries in place that take care of oneself. So I think both suggestions are harmful and potentially dangerous. Let's make it very clear. Out of everybody that I've worked with over the last 15 plus years, I only have 2 people who have ended contact with one of their parents. So just to kind of put it into perspective, it's in my practice more rare than it is obviously common. That being said, I personally have chosen to end contact with both of my parents. And that's a decision that I knew to be true when I was 15 years old, but took me 20 years to actually be able to implement. So when I was 15, I knew that having my parents in my life was harmful, poisonous, toxic, destructive. But as most 15-year-olds, I didn't have the ability yet to do anything about that, As soon as I could leave home, I did. I did in contact for short periods of times, whether it be a few years at a time, but I wasn't able to sustain it until the eve of my 36th birthday. So that's when I was able to finally say, you know what, this is what's right for me and for my family.
And I think in both of our constitutions, there was something that was like, I need to know that I've given it my all and tried from all the angles, and it's the only way that I'm going to feel at peace with this decision. There can't be a creeping doubt that, oh, if maybe if I had tried this. And so, at least for me personally, it was important that it came from that kind of place. It was no kind of knee-jerk decision.
Oh my God, no. I don't think I've ever put more time and thought and energy into making a decision than that decision, other than maybe having a child. And even once that decision, once I got to a place where I felt more clear that that was what I needed to do, it still took me 2 years of weekly therapy with, my highly skilled therapist that I see to support me in getting to that place. So, and what I would like from society in this seemingly shocking or taboo decision is if somebody tells you that they don't have contact with their family and that person, seems of sound mind, I hope the response is, I'm so incredibly sorry for your loss and that it was so bad that that's what had to happen. Because it is a huge loss and it's very lonely to lose your family and the people that you have shared memories with from your childhood, and to not have that support there, which wasn't there in the first place, which is why the decision is made. But it's an incredibly, probably the most painful thing to go through in life.
You feel like you're losing a part of yourself.
Yes.
You quite literally are, like the reflections, the memories, the shared history. It's so much a part of what makes you want to stay in.
Yeah.
And it's truly a loss.
It is. And that's why I think there's so many things in between that if it is possible to do, we can do to take care of ourselves, with family or friends, where dynamics are going on that are causing harm. And there are a lot of choices that we have around how to protect ourselves.
Yeah, and there's a lot of steps beforehand, and I even think of our own stories and the kind of interventions we tried to implement to find an appropriate distance and dosage in the different relationships. Because sometimes if a relationship is hard, just kind of taking a step back and having a little bit less intimacy can bring the temperature down, and sometimes you can find something sustainable if there's just less interaction.
Yeah.
And we took those steps on numerous occasions, with my brothers, with your parents, and we were so sad to feel like our hands were forced, that from the other end there was this kind of bombardment and
invasion.
And if the other person isn't willing to accept that kind of détente and find a working rhythm, well, then your hand is forced.
I mean, I think I'll say two things here. One is, it's very important to mention that if addiction and or mental health is involved, mental health issues is involved, you're talking about a very different scenario.
Yeah.
When you lose the ability to trust the other person, to feel safe, for there to be any reasoning, it's not fair to put it in the same context as another situation, just point blank.
Yeah, and a lot of times the scenario we were talking about earlier, where you feel like you're helping the person, the situation is kind of a black hole where it's like there's no amount of helping that's going to improve or get it to that good place, and so it gets stuck in this kind of holding pattern.
That's the number one signal,
right,
that it's a toxic situation, right? But all of that being said, I am going to say something a bit radical, or might seem a bit radical, is I also genuinely believe that if we're coming from our authentic self, that for whatever reason, it's a no. Like, no, I don't want to be in that relationship. No, I don't want that contact. That is also okay. We don't need to have an arsenal of proof or justification for our no. It can just be no. And let's kind of scale this back and take this, something with our 3-year-old daughter. Look, she gets to have a no with us all day long, she knows go away. She knows no, don't touch me, So it's not a no, get out of my life, but it's a no, I don't want a hug right now. No, I don't want to sit on your lap. No, I don't want you in my room. I want to be in my room by myself. So she gets to have a no and advocate for herself and have her boundaries and have her autonomy, because she is her own person. And as long as she's not causing harm to herself or to us, then she gets to have her no, and we respect that. because that's what fosters trust and safety within any relationship. And usually, when a person doesn't feel safe in a relationship, it's because they don't get to have a no. It's because they don't get to have boundaries, and things are feeling like they're just happening to them and they're powerless in it. And that's usually when we have a problem. Okay, so kind of want to just close up here by circling back around to Saturn and just seeing if there's anything else that wants to come through around this theme versus authenticity versus duty. If there's anything else that comes to mind, or just anything else that feels like it wants to come through right now. Or do we feel complete?
I feel pretty complete.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I think what we're talking about is provocative. I think that there is another conversation that I'd like to have about the implications of this on a societal level. We could get into the whole themes around different parenting styles, and talk about the roots of the use of power within those different parenting styles, which then we see at all levels of governance, including in politics today. So, there is a way that what we're talking about here with Saturn has very real consequences on every level of being. And I guess this is what the last thing I'll say is Saturn has a component of it in its shadow form that relates to punishment. But in its positive sense, it is consequence. And consequence, even though it has sometimes a negative connotation, actually just means it's a cause and effect. There's a natural cause and effect. So in something like peaceful parenting, which is not permissive parenting, peaceful parenting, we have boundaries and mutual respect, but instead of punishment, I'm going to shame you or blame you for being human, for growing, for trial and error, for making mistakes, which is all Saturn. I am going to support you and teach you and guide you, all Saturn, into the natural consequences with sequence of things. When you do A, B happens, and I'm going to help you understand the natural consequences of things. Versus I'm going to punish you for not already knowing, or I'm going to punish you for not having your brain be developmentally in a place where you're capable of these things, right? And so what we see is we live in a society that is mainly constructed around punishment instead of consequence. And so when we're talking about instead of having power over, but having power with, we don't punish each other, we don't shame each other, but instead we talk about the natural consequences of what's present based upon the actions and decisions that we make in any given moment.
Because we really do a disservice to the other when we hold in those consequences.
Yes.
When we don't allow our authentic reaction to come out, and we put up with what we think we're supposed to put up with in a family or a job or a social situation, and resentment builds and all kinds of yuckiness happens. I think we need to feel from one another the natural consequences of how we're acting so that we can co-regulate.
Absolutely. This is a huge part of couples therapy, is how do we facilitate open and honest communication when something that the other person is doing hurts us, and say, it hurts me when you say this. It hurts me when you do this. I hurt, ouch, when this. And then helping educate and teach the other person how to love you, how to take care of you. And if the other person can be non-defensive and open and listen and say, oh, this is how I love you. I see. I'm going to work on that. I'm sorry I caused you harm. Now, I know better. I can do better, right? There's a rupture and then there's a repair.
Mm-hmm.
That is the healthy manifestation of Saturn. Being able to navigate that. And here's the thing. Okay, this will be the last thing I say is when we live from a place of duty, we are more likely to be defensive and not be able to actually deeply listen. When we live from a place of authenticity, we are much better at listening and responding to life from a non-reactive and non-defensive place. Thank you so much, Travis, for this very enlightening and real, honest conversation today.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us. This is episode 46. Today is July 22nd, 2024. We're so honored to be able to get to share this time and this space with you. And stay tuned. We're really excited for our new astrology course happening this fall. And more is going to be announced around that. Synastry and composite charts taught by yours truly, and also some astrology events that are going to be open to everybody coming up in the next couple months. We'll see you next time. We are dreamed into existence.
What we do with that dream is up to us.
How we dream is as important as what we dream.
For the what of the dream knows itself through the how.